everybody, and welcome to the Black Men with Purpose podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, it's a pleasure to have you with us. This is a safe space where we share our thoughts on a multitude of topics in hopes of helping Black males, young and not so young, overcome obstacles and challenges that can be hindrances to happiness, productivity, and success. We believe that through our experiences, successes, and failures, we can have some conversations that might help other Black males in their respective journeys through this thing called life. And as we return in season 5, well, this is the second episode, today's conversation is one that might make some people uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always a bad thing. Sometimes discomfort is what happens right before growth. So with that in mind, let's talk about how for generations, the Black church was more than a place of worship. It was a refuge. It was a strategy room, a safe house, a community center, a political headquarters. It was where movements were born. It was where our people gathered when the world outside treated us as we were less than human. So, considering the Black church, we know that it helped fuel the civil rights movement. It produced leaders, organizers, educators, musicians, activists, and visionaries. It gave people hope when hope was hard to find. But somewhere along the way, many people, especially this younger generation, began to disconnect. Some feel judged instead of embraced. Some feel like the church has lost its way. Some feel that they're preached at instead of listened to. Some feel like the church became more focused on survival than transformation. So tonight we're going to ask the question, is the Black church still a sleeping giant capable of changing communities and shaping movements? Or has it become disconnected from the very people who need it the most? And if it is sleeping, then how do we wake it up, fellas? So let's just look at the historical foundation of the church. I want to start here because I think context matters. I mean, we can't talk about where the church is now without understanding what it once was and what it once meant to Black people in America, especially. When segregation existed and when the opportunities were denied, when our communities were under attack and all kinds of things, the church wasn't even an option. It was essential. So fellas, I just want to ask y'all, what do you think made the Black church so powerful during that era? And what can we do to return it back to that era of power? So let's start with Dr. B and see what you have to say about that.
Good evening, fellas. How y'all doing? Everything is well. I think what you started with, talking about the spiritual refuge of the Black church. Like you said, it was a place of hope. It was a place of stability. And I still think it is to some degree. Some churches have evolved, like you said. You talked about some churches have just basically survived, and some churches have evolved. So I think it's a learning curve for some churches in the sense of leaders have now. When I was growing up, you went to your pastor for everything. Your pastor was your marriage counselor, your social calendar counselor. And I think now what we're seeing is churches that are evolving, realizing that one, you can't put everything on the pastor, and that two, you actually need people who have gone to school. And I'm not saying education is everything, but it does help when you have somebody that has a psychology background, of somebody who actually has a degree in marital counseling, someone who actually that has, experience as a youth pastor. So it does play a vital part when, and also budgeting, before churches was like, hey, just give us your nickels and dimes, pay your tithe and offering. And we didn't know how to invest that money now. Now you see Black churches that are investing their money as well. They're buying property. Alpha Street here in the DC area did an amazing thing last month. They took over $1 million from the church and kept hundreds of families from being evicted. So those are the type of things that you do see Black churches that are doing. They're doing scholarships now. But at the same time, on the flip side of that, you have some folks that feel like, well, the church should do everything and I shouldn't have to contribute at all. So, it's almost like your relationship with God. It's like you want God to do all the work, but you don't want to show up for the hard stuff. So, I see both sides of it, but I still see the church as being a relevant part of our community as Black people. It's always evident that when there's a crisis, guess where they go? We go back to the Black church. When somebody dies in a community or somebody's killed, in the community, they go back to the Black church to settle the community. So I still believe it's relevant. Do we have to make some changes and show growth? Absolutely. I don't think you can still have a church with the mentality from 1950. You definitely got to blend the old with the new, and then you got to be willing to move forward. So it's just like anything else we do in life. Everything that we spent money on, even for us 25 years ago, hey, that same money don't go as far. So, yep. So the churches have to do the same thing. So I'm done. I'll kick it over to the senior statesman of the group, Brother Rod.
Perfecto.
Yeah, thank you. How y'all doing today? When Brother Byron was talking, I was just kind of thinking about the evolution of the Black church, and I mean, I think culturally, I think it'll always have relevance in our communities. I do think that Black folks being on the come up financially and otherwise in this country that brought us here and enslaved us, built this country on our backs, when we felt like we could partake in the things that we used to only conceive or watch, I think a lot of people got away from depending on, leaning on the church in the way that we used to, out of a lot of necessity. Our ancestors did, to have a sense of community and togetherness. And, unfortunately, I think, that along with a lot of other things, we've just paid a steep price for. Not to say that you can't have both or have it all, but sometimes with that, you start making little sacrifices, little by little, until you get, farther and farther away from the real reason that, we've always, leaned on and depended on, the word, the community, and then also the examples. For as many men that didn't stay, a lot of men did. And they made the church go. And they were the reasons that the church supported, and I guess gave hope to the communities. And watching that and seeing that example, gave you something that you could really, kind of lean into and depend on. And I just think that over time, it was eroded by, chasing material gain and making more money so that I can have a bigger home or, more things because, I want more for mine than I had, or that my ancestors were able to do for me. But But ultimately, I will say that, we've always heard people talk about, the love of money being the root of all evil. And I think you can add selfishness right next to it, and as time has gone by, we just don't seem to be as empathetic or even supportive of one another as we should or could be. And we've talked about this before, where you look back at smaller communities, some larger communities of people in this country, that no matter what you say about them, they have a sense of togetherness that helps them move forward as a community of people, as a race of people in this same country, in the same environment with some of them similar challenges. But there are some things that they just refuse to let go of. And I think that that's what it ultimately, would take for us to kind of experience some of the same, forward motion as other communities. And I don't know about you all, but when I grew up in the church, while the pastor was revered and respected, he just wasn't always in the news. He just was, he was, you could pretty much set your clock by him being there. And for as much as people like to complain about what they may not have gotten or don't get, it's a lot to be said for that, and I think we need to think more about what they do or the good that they could do, rather than always finding fault in the things that we don't necessarily like or have grown to appreciate. But anyway, as you see, we could probably talk about this forever and a day. So I will not take away any more time and turn it over to Brother Ray.
Appreciate you, Rod. And it's good to be with y'all again. Once again, thankful to be part of this group. This was a little tough for me. Byron hit on some key points. Rod has hit on some key points, and I keep coming back to these points. Like the church evolving or remaining stagnant. There are some churches that have remained stagnant. It's like there's like what we used to hate about the military. It's like you have the dinosaurs that are there that don't want to evolve and don't want to change. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it's going to be. And the people are different. So I do believe that the church does need to evolve. I know you all talked about how the pastors, the clergy used to be the backbone of the community, the go-to, we're now, and it's been like this for at least 10 years. It seems like we look towards our successful athletes for guidance, to be that voice, versus where back in the day it used to be the clergy. It used to be Dr. King. It used to be Ralph Abernathy. It used to be other ministers, popular ministers. I mean, we've been talking about Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton was a voice for us. Where now it's like it seems like we as Black people, to me, are looking for LeBron James to be the leader of the community, for Dwayne Wade or any other prominent Black athlete, we're expecting them to speak up and speak out. And then we get upset when a politician or somebody or a right wing news anchor tells them, you know what, shut up and dribble. Well, that wasn't their role back in the day. Yeah, we did have a few, we did have the Jim Browns, we did have the Muhammad Ali's, we did have the Bill Russells, but it's like they were few and far between when it came to our community leaning on or looking towards them for guidance. We always seem to lean towards the clergy. And then the last thing was the races sticking together. I mean, we've talked about that over the seasons. It seems like every other racial dynamic sticks together except us. We don't want to support our own, where the Koreans or the Muslims or whomever, the white community, they will go and spend their money and keep it in their community, where we will go and take our money and spend it elsewhere versus supporting each other because we don't want to spend more or don't want to seemingly support one another. So I do believe the church does need to evolve, and I feel like I'm starting to get long-winded again. So I'll toss it back to you, Brother John.
All right. Yeah. So I agree with what Brother Rod said. Definitely the potential for us to just talk on and on if we don't take some time to frame this conversation. And so just for the purpose of framing it, the political power of the church and how the church was at the forefront. It's very understandable if you think historically. I always liken it to, even though this was so long ago for all of us, even with me being the most recent, this was still many decades ago in basic training. The one time that we could get free to kind of just be like ourselves and, just have some time was when we went to worship. And I think we have to remember especially how a lot of the traditions and the way that we worship in the Black church formed, because it was a resistance movement along with worship. And so while we worshiped, we also plotted and planned, and we also had an opportunity to be away from listening ears. And even when there were listening ears, we learned a way to code that conversation in our spiritual conversation so that we couldn't be so easily intercepted by slave masters and oppressors and so forth and so on. But I think through the thing, I really like the balance, because it's easy to say, oh, people need to get better, and then not recognize the institutions that are failing people. Or it's easy to say the institution needs to get better and not recognize how people are not being supportive of said institutions. And so I do think it's a very multifaceted situation. But I also want to look at, and not I want to look at, how about we present a question? So I think about it now, some of the churches that I worshiped at over the last 15, 20 years or so, y'all know how we did. We get in our cars and we drive 20, 30 minutes, pull up into a church parking lot, worship, spend some time, and then hop in our cars and leave. And if you're traveling 20, 30 minutes, the first thing that tells me is that the church isn't in your community. And if you're leaving as soon as church is over, that is showing us that a lot of times churches aren't positioned to be in the community, helping the community. I think of some prominent churches I went to, they were way out, and most of us drove to get to them and then went on about our way back to where we lived and didn't do any kind of outreach, didn't have any connection to the actual community where the church was. And then other things that I think about was, as other options and as church became more of a chic thing to do and less community-based, did it become a time when we started depending on the church less because we depended less on community? And so I guess the question I want to pose to you brothers as we move on is, was the church stronger and more politically active because we as a people depended on each other more? And is that, in any of your opinions, a reason why maybe the church is not as visible, because we don't depend on each other as much anymore? And so because we're not depending on the church as much anymore. Dr. B, what say ye?
You know, I tell people that we are our ancestors' prayers. You know, our grandparents, who, as John alluded to in the beginning, because during the week they was called the N-word. And so at church on Sunday, that's when they had a title. They was deacon, or, you know, a minister, or sister so-and-so, you know, on the Saturdays and Sunday, or when they went to church to Bible study, they were actually given an identity. And so now we are the answers to their prayers, because they pray for us to be successful. They pray for us to go to school. They pray for us to have jobs. They pray for us to be directors and be multimillionaires. And that's what we have now. So we have people now that go to church that, yeah, their grandparents were sharecroppers, or their grandparents worked in the steel mill, or their grandparents worked at the chicken plant, but they prayed for their children and their children's children. And now guess what we've done? Now we got our children are graduating from Harvard. We're graduating from Michigan. We're graduating from UCLA, or we are running an organization where we have 100 people report to us, or we managing a budget that are, you know, millions, sometimes 7-8 figures. And so because of that, it's like we're not able to give that time like we did before. I know when we was growing up, you was in church all day on Sunday. It was, you went to Sunday school at 9 o'clock, then it was morning worship, then you came back for 3:30 service, and then you came back for Sunday night service. And again, because our people were alienated during the week, or they worked so hard for the man, and again, because they were called out of their name, or their prayer was for my children to be better. So now, because some of us, we are the answer to that prayer. Some of us may have gotten away from our first love, or some of us are like, hey, I can't go to church all day because I'm a principal at a school and I got a staff of 25 people and I got 400 kids that I got to manage, and I got to be prepared and ready and rested. So, you know, I got to go to the 8 o'clock service so I can go home and get ready for the work day. So I alluded to that it's a blessing and a curse. So we are a blessing to what our ancestors prayed for, but then it also maybe had pulled us away from the foundation of what the church was doing. But at the same time, it's almost like there's a group of people that do go to church that want to give back to the community. They want to give back to the youth because they are the answered prayer for the ancestors. And so to me, we have to make sure that no matter how often and how much that God blesses us, that we always got to be able to be willing to pull back, go back to, hey, let me pull somebody else up spiritually, emotionally, financially. And I don't think we do that enough. You know, I think Ray made a mention to how other communities stick together. I mean, it's evident with, you know, that mega group that this dude can do no wrong, and they're gonna support him no matter what. Yeah, I call them mega. They support him no matter what, lie after lie, and the reason they do is because they benefit from that. You know, sometimes our people, we don't want to play the long game and even give back to people. We feel like that it should be instant gratification. I've been a member at this church for 60 days. I should be able to pay and get my wedding paid for, no free of charge at the church, you know. And so because of that, sometimes we take advantage of what the church has done for the community, and we don't want to be the ones giving back. So I think for us, let's give back to that core that got us here. So that's the way I see it. But I'm gonna leave it over to Brother Ron, see what he got to say.
Yeah, I mean, great points, Dr. B. I do think that it goes both ways, and it's a two-way street regarding church being there to support the people, and then the people conversely supporting the church. And it's always been mutually beneficial, right? But again, I think back to as a lot of people have become more successful by society standards, they don't spend as much time necessarily. And of course, this is not all, but I think in today's, we can say it maybe most, the majority don't spend as much time in the church or building the church the way that they used to. I mean, when's the last time you've been to a church and, after Sunday service, everybody met in the fellowship hall and broke bread together, and talked about those things outside of just the Word of God. Talked about, hey, elections are coming up, and, our ancestors, died for us to have the right and the ability to vote. And we want to make sure that, that we honor that. I don't care who you vote for, but, by all means do that, or we're having, some things going on in the school here in the neighborhood, in the community. And we need, we need fathers and men to show up at the schools. We need to volunteer at the schools so they see, Black men in the schools being supportive. And so I just think it goes, both ways. And then in return, the church has just always been a place where we could go and feel welcome. And a lot of people feel that now, the come as you are, it wasn't always necessarily that way. But today, you can roll up in your, your warm-up suit and people will not look at you strangely. Right. So, but I think we have to recognize that there's still power in numbers. Our voice is louder when we're together, and find ways to do that. And it's not always about, well, I don't want to be at church for 3 hours. To go do what? Watch the game in your man cave where you could actually be giving back to someone that's less fortunate than you, or maybe that need you and your presence. So I think it's a great point, John, but for me, I say that, we have to see the value in giving back and being part of that collective voice, which then starts that collective movement where we're not just saying that, you know what, hey, we're going to vote for this party, this group, because we've always done it. No, everyone needs to be held accountable. We're held accountable. Everyone should be held accountable, you know, and let that be your rule and guide. You know, for me to vote for and to follow someone that has openly spoken against the things that I value, that's hypocrisy. It's disingenuous, and I just think that, you know, we got to look in the mirror more. I'll leave it at that, Brother Ray.
I was getting ready to write something down, Rod. you hit the nail on the head, man. God, especially when you talked about people voting for someone that's against our best interests. A lot of times, in my opinion, we seem to, just going back to the 2024 election, folks were ready to vote for that man because of the stimulus check that was sent out. You know, that was their reason for voting for that individual, is because he had a stimulus check that he gave us money. And like you said, it's our values that need to be put in check. You talked about the church supporting people. We've all talked about, what are you going to do? Rod said it. You don't want to be in church for 3 hours. Why? Because you're going to go home and sit in your man cave and watch the game. Well, the pastors know that too, because I know my pastor, when I lived in Maryland, was like, look, church is going to be over by, the last service is going to be over by 12:30 because the Redskins are kicking off at 1:00, and I want to be home to watch the game. And I know y'all do too. That was what he said during football season. And every man in their doggone place that was a football fan was bouncing their heads up and down. Yep, let's go. You know, so one thing I would say for me, you know, what the church was for me, it wasn't just a gathering place, but it really served as a place of comfort for me. Especially if I was going through something, if I was going through a divorce, if I was going through something at work, a family member was sick or what have you, you know, that was just where I wanted to be at. I wanted to be around like-minded people, praying people, you know, and I felt comforted by being there. One of the things I do believe is that, well, one thing we do know, and I know John touched on this earlier, the church was a place, you know, it was a community for us to be able to sit down and back in the day, before emancipation, and we could plot, or we could, after emancipation, we could gather and set up meetings or sit-ins, or, you know, because our people were fighting for our rights. So we no longer have to do that now, you know, and we are able to, and we constantly exercise our right to free speech. And then we also have different methods to be able to spread the messages that we want to spread. You know, we have social media, we've got podcasts like ours. There are different methods of being able to get the messages out. But one thing I will say, the last thing I'm going to say is, I know Rod has said something about hypocrisy. I know a lot of people that look at ministers, some ministers, as hypocrites. You know, because I can tell you, it burned me to no end when I saw the video of Marvin Sapp telling the ushers to lock the doors because they didn't raise enough money. Or I've seen a video of a minister berating this lady because she raised as much money as she could for her tithes, and she didn't raise the money that he wanted, that the pastor wanted, and he berated her in front of the entire church. Well, maybe that woman did the best that she could, and I know God said he only wanted us to give no more than 10%, but it was like 10% according to whom? Because when I saw this man berating this woman, it was like, okay, you said a dollar amount for her instead of her giving you what she could afford. I mean, she had kids to feed, and we've seen examples of people that they only gave so much, and the pastors or the preachers or whomever were going off on these folks, and they're like, look, I got a family to feed now. So, well, and they tell them, well, God will provide. Well, yes, I trust that God will provide, but I have to make sure on my end that I'm taking care of my family. And again, I just think that I've seen instances of the hypocrisy. I've seen a pastor that was in Columbus, Pastor Forbes, Columbus, Ohio. He was too busy bragging about his friendship with Deion Sanders. The man could preach, but trust me, the man could preach. But his big thing was all the celebrities he knew, and he wanted everybody to know that he was friends with Deion Sanders, and it's like he was in competition with these other mega pastors. He wanted a private jet, and he expected the church to pay for it. And I'm going down this rabbit hole, so I'm going to stop, and 'cause I'm sure we're going to come back around to it or some part of it. So, Brother John, what do you got?
Yeah, I think again, framing the conversation about the political power of the church. I like what everybody had to say. I appreciate, more importantly, what everybody had to say. And I definitely appreciate how many varied opinions and perspectives and ways forward that we bring. And so just thinking from, because like when you want to talk about preachers and ministers misbehaving, man, just throw a rock. You'll probably hit one. You know what I mean? That's gonna happen. So that's a part of it. For every story that Ray just brought up that had made the headlines, I could probably think of two more. That cat Brian Carnes is berating a musician over some song that he was trying to do or whatever, and just ridiculousness. So, but it's always, I think, Dr. B can really attest to this. I think we all can. It's always, there's this prominent that these are misbehaving, but we all know that for every misbehaving minister, preacher, church leader, there's at least 100 that are just putting their heads down and going to work and serving people day in and day out, staying out the way of all this other stuff, and being at the hospital praying for families, and being at schools supporting our children and in the community. So I think that's important. And not to get in trouble with the fellas, but I think this is important. Back then, the church didn't just talk about heaven. It talked about housing, voting rights, education, economic survival, community defense. There's a connection between spiritual and social responsibility. And I think a lot of people today are just asking, where did the connection go? And I think we should ask why people got disconnected. I mean, sometimes you just have to deal with the hard part honestly. And so there's a lot of younger folks, Gen Z, millennials, that walked away from church spaces altogether. A lot of them still believe in God. A lot of them still value spirituality, but sometimes they just don't trust the institution. And I think we got to ask the question, why do we feel that happened? And I think there's a multitude of reasons. We talked about it a little bit. The hypocrisy. Some people are turned off by a prosperity gospel, the politics in church, and not the politics that we're talking about, but the other politics in church. Lack of mental health awareness is a big one, over spiritualizing mental health issues, how women are treated, LGBTQ plus tensions, younger voices often not being heard. Kind of like we spoke to, churches becoming businesses. So I want to say this carefully. I mean, criticism isn't hatred, and wanting the church to evolve, that I don't think it's an attack on faith, because sometimes accountability is actually love. And sometimes saying, hey, this is where we lost the way. One of the examples that I use a lot was in the movie The Help. I used to make the joke that everything was time period accurate. My son agreeing with me. Everything was time period accurate. The cars, the houses, everything. And I said, except the church, because when they went to the church, it looked like the same church that I go to today. And it was a joke. It's tongue in cheek. But, in some cases, have we really asked of ourselves, and not all of them, but is the church as an institution really evolving? Is it really addressing the issues today? I'm not going to speak on where anybody stands on this, but some of the most powerful, thoughtful voices in the Black church now are the voices of women. And we see that there's still oppression. There are still large churches that say we don't allow women in the pulpit. And then there's this conversation, and I don't want to get deep into it because, Ray touched on the tithe issue, and that goes a lot of ways. A few years back, Creflo Dollar was like, you know what? I think we've been teaching tithing wrong all this time. And anybody that went to school and did a couple of classes was like, yeah, you think? I mean, come on. A lot of the stuff we do isn't because it has some actual foundation in the word. There's a business to be accountable for. When we talk about how often we've been to church, all of us have been to church hundreds, if not thousands more times than Jesus ever did. You know what I mean? So like when we talk about some of that stuff, but I think sometimes asking this institution that we still love, because no matter what we say about what has happened to the church, it is still a prominent institution in the world and in our community especially. It was interesting. They talked about it this year. Ramadan and Lent fell at the same time, and they talked about how powerful it was to have over 4 billion, probably 4.5 billion people all at one time fasting and dedicating themselves to God. That's more than half of the population of the world. And that was Christians and Muslims coming together. And you think about it, that's a powerful thing. And so when you think about numbers like that, you think about what the church could be if we were willing to ask the question, how do we elevate? Maybe it's not fair to expect movements to look like they did in the 1960s, because like Ray said, we don't have a lot of the things that were pressing us as a community in the 1960s, and we have different capability, and we got to recognize every generation fights differently. And so I don't think the goal is to recreate the past. That's my personal opinion. I think our goal is to carry forward the spirit of the courage of justice and the collective responsibility that the church holds. So, that's where I am with it, but I definitely don't want to monopolize the moment. So I'm going to ask Ray. Ray, you got any, I don't want to say rebuttals, maybe something additive to what I just said?
Yeah, because I can't disagree with anything you said. I'm sitting here looking at my notes as you were talking, and you're hitting on a majority of the points that I had. You know, even you know, the youth of the church now they have a different thought process than we had. You know, I know for me, you know, whatever I was going along with whatever my mom said. You know, I went along with whatever my people said. This is how it is. This is how the way it's going to be, and that's the way it's always going to be. You know, and it took me to get away from there, and I was really looking for something along the same lines. And then when I got out on my own, and I started going to different churches, and I'm listening to preachers preaching. And I'm like, okay, they're saying the same things, but you can see they're saying it in a different context. And these kids, I don't want to talk about kids. The younger generations now, they just seem like they have a freer way of thinking. John, you talked about the LGBTQ community. You know, when I was coming up, I'm a self-proclaimed I'm a former homophobe. You know, I believe that if you were gay, you were going to hell. I believed in my first marriage that if I got a divorce, I was going to hell. You know, and it took my uncle, who was a minister, to tell me, you do realize that God created divorce, right? And I never thought of it that way. You know, because he was telling me, you know, in different cultures, you know, if somebody didn't want to be with their wife, they kill them. And I'm like, what? And he said, yeah, so God created divorce so you wouldn't have to commit murder. I'm like, okay, I can kind of see that. You know, and then it took my mom to say something else to me, that one of my favorite ministers ever, Reverend Mosley, that he had been divorced 4 times. And I'm like, what? And she said, do you think he's in hell? I'm like, no, not at all. You know, and so it literally took me to grow and realize that I had to evolve. Even with my homophobic behavior before, I had to evolve. And then what really set that straight for me, what really solidified it for me, I mean, I had already reformed, but just a few years ago, my daughter, and you all know the story about me and Elise, she basically came out and said that how would I feel if she told me that she were gay? And or that she said, how would you feel if I told you I was gay or I had gay friends? And now I'm like, well, honestly, it wouldn't bother me, because back in the day, yeah, that would have upset me. But I'm not going to love you any less because you choose to be who you are. And it took me to see my bonus daughter loving who she loved for it to really hit home for me. And I'm like, I don't love her any less. I don't love Simone any less. So if she's gay, I'm okay with it. I mean, I can't be convinced that all gay people go to hell. I just can't. God is a forgiving God. Or I should say, Jesus is forgiving. And he's advocating on, from what I was taught, advocating on our behalf. You know, so when I said that to Elise, that I have no problem with it if you tell me that you are. She said, well, I'm not, I'm straight, but I just want to know how you feel because mom said that she doesn't do this gay stuff. And I'm like, well, that's because your mom hasn't evolved yet. I said, and I had, as a man, had to grow. So, so I know this younger generation, Gen Zers and these millennials, they think differently. They have a different thought process than we all do. And I believe that we all just have to get off of our dinosaur or our prehistoric way of thinking. And I think a lot of folks just need to evolve. because things are going to change. The more things change, the more they say. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But I believe that wholeheartedly, that we just have to evolve. I believe the church has to evolve as well. So I'm honestly curious as to know what Dr. B has to say on this.
What'd you say, John?
I said,
He said,
Dr. B, Dr. B.
I put it like this. We was talking about, to me, the relationship that we have with church, it's faith based. And what I mean by that is that our relationship with God is always about our faith in him, not so much our faith in the institution or faith in the pastor or the spiritual leader. It's about your relationship with God. So for me personally, and again, I believe in the tithing. If you give your 10%, that God will take the other 90% and he will bless you more abundantly. So that's for me in my house. And I'm a product of that. My parents taught me that. And my parents were evident. My dad was a welder, and my mom was a social worker, and they instilled we paying our tithes. And we never went without. My parents had the same phone number for 50 years. They lived in the same house. We never experienced having our utilities turned off. We never experienced having a car repossessed. Part of the Bible says that the Lord will rebuke the devourer if you trust him with your tithes. And a lot of times that just means your washer and dryer going to be running. Your car won't break down, that the Lord will continue to look out for you because you have your faith in him. So a lot of times what we're seeing is that people want to put faith in themselves because, again, we are a product of our ancestors' prayers. Because now we feel like, well, I've arrived. I got my education. I got my good job making 6 figures. I can make my own decision. And God, I'll call you if I need you. Instead of saying, you know what, I'm going to do this faith thing and I'm going to trust God regardless to what people say, regardless to what people do. Because a lot of times we'll put more faith in the institution, more faith in the spiritual leader, and we forget that they're human. When you look in the Bible, you see that Moses was human. You'll see that David was human. You will see that they were human and they made mistakes. But the one thing they did was they found a way to turn back to God. They didn't keep running with that mistake. So I'm not saying that people are making mistakes, but for me, it's my faith and my belief that God is going to order my steps. So it's like you either believe the Bible or you don't. But at some point, you got to say, I'm either going to trust God or I'm not. And so when you get to the point where you say, well, I'm going to handle this on my own, God, then you got to say, well, I'll deal with the consequences. But I'd rather say, you know what, I'm going to trust God in this, because a lot of times when we experience calamity, when we experience setbacks, we don't realize that God is still working in the background. And so a lot of times people become frustrated. Or they do go to the church, and guess what? The church is not equipped to deal with you with your situation, and because they're just not. If you're having a mental health crisis or you're having significant problems with your marriage, guess what? The spiritual leader may not be qualified to handle that for you. And so sometimes people become frustrated with that instead of still having their faith in God instead of with the institution. It's still okay to go to the institution, to have that network. And guess what? Some churches are prepared for that. First Baptist of Glen Arden here in the DC area, they have over 125 ministries that help with almost every type of community issue that we can deal with or think of. So it just depends on, what organization has, and even with that, guess what? That church has all those ministries. There are still some people that left that church and say, this church can't help me. And that's okay, but as long as you still have your faith in God. And like I said, for me, and I'm just speaking for myself, I just believe that faith matters, because in the Bible, the word faith is listed over 400 times. So it means something that, if you have faith in God, not so much in yourself, so not so much in the institution, but if you have faith in God, whatever situation that you're going to come up with, God is going to help you get through it if you have that faith. So that's just my interpretation of it, So I'm just believing that God said in His Word He gonna do what He say He gonna do. He gonna provide the promises for you. So that's who I am. So I'm done with that. So, Brother Rod.
Brother, wow. I've been knowing you a long time, brother, and I will tell you, I don't think I've ever heard you be so eloquent about what I know is truly in your heart, and I appreciate that. I think one of the things that jumped out was that people's experiences, and I think sometimes we forget that people really are shaped by their experiences, and I would tell you, I didn't, in my early years, I wasn't at church every Sunday. And I think just by the grace of God, I, fell into a situation where I had the opportunity to be exposed to the word and what I believe was true teachings of the word. And it literally changed my life. Not just because I learned about the importance of having, your own personal relationship, with God, but all the other things that came from that. And it was the experiences, I think, that shaped me the most. Even when, like I think Brother John had said, no, you had said, Dr. B, those that turn away from God find their way back. And I just think that's a real thing, but I think it truly is shaped by our experiences. And so I'm not going to, try to cloud anything that you said, because I think that what you communicated was eloquently done. And I agree with a lot of what you said, if not all of it. But I will say that it is my hope that people in general can recognize that faith, relationship with God is a personal journey, and you can't look at anyone else and try to gauge your own. You have to establish that for yourself. You have to actually do the work for yourself. It's almost like looking at Brother John and his lady and be like, oh yeah, I can live through him and date her. But I gotta go get it on my own, right? Literally. So, that just doesn't make sense. And I think it's the same way in how we look at, God, spirituality, and ultimately how we act and behave regarding that, because, it'll be shaped by your experiences, by your beliefs, and by what you value. The tithe thing, again, you have a relationship with God. And one thing I have learned, though, is that, you if you're paying attention, you will be convicted about a lot of stuff. Now, people don't necessarily act upon it when they feel or experience that conviction, but they know. I mean, we've been a lot of places and probably done a lot of things. We always knew when we were wrong. you know, always. But you have to come to the point where you're like, yeah, no, I can't do that anymore. You know. So I again appreciate you you know, conveying what was in your heart there, brother. And with that, I will look back to Brother John and give him the assist. Over to you.
Ray, did you get a chance to share your thoughts yet, or?
Yeah, I think I shared
Ray went first.
Okay. Just checking. Just checking. You know, I appreciate everything that we've shared. I think it was important to have a conversation about this tonight. I think it was important to, you know, I'm always amazed and I'm always appreciative of the directions that these conversations take. They take a life of their own, and you come to learn. You know, I put a good amount of time and study into the topics and sharing the ideas and doing the outlines and things, but the ability for it to take on a life of its own, that's something you can't outline, you can't schedule. And so these conversations do take a life of their own. So with that, I say I appreciate the perspective that we've got. And I think tonight's conversation also reminds us of something important. And that's that institutions are only as alive as the people inside them. And whether you're deeply religious, skeptical, spiritual, disconnected, or somewhere in between, one thing's undeniable. Black church helped shape Black history in America. The question now is whether it still has the courage to help shape Black future. Not through control, not through fear, but through service, through compassion, more importantly, through justice and community. And maybe the giant is sleeping and maybe not, but it's definitely not dead. And so we're gonna close it out like we do every week with a quote. And I'm gonna quote someone familiar, a giant in our faith and a giant in the political conversation of the Black church. And the quote simply says, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. Martin Luther King Jr. And with that thought, we thank you for tuning in. And again, I thank the brothers for such diverse perspectives. And with that, we will see y'all next time.